Hi, and welcome to this Learning Week 2025 session on the fundamentals of classification. I'm joined today by Joshua Morgan from ParalympicsGB, whose name and whose title is so long, I'm going to let him introduce it, because I'll never get it right.
Hi everyone. I am the Athlete Services Manager responsible for classification for Paralympics GB, and thank you for joining today. Rick has asked me to come along and just run through some of the fundamentals of classification and kind of give an oversight of what it's about, and yeah, hopefully give you guys a little bit of an insight into that world. And if you have any questions at the end or after, then I'm sure they can be passed on to me to answer all of them. It's an area that I think everybody just needs a little bit more understanding of, and hopefully we can do that today and help you with that. So the first part of it is, what is the purpose of classification? The IPC defines the purpose of classification to enable athletes with an eligible impairment to participate in competitive para sport. I kind of see that as it resulting in athletes being grouped into classifications where all of the athletes are impaired to a similar level to each other in for that specific sport, which aims to create a fair and competitive environment for all of the athletes in there. Obviously, different sports and different athletes and impairments are going to then fall into different classifications based on how the impairment affects each athlete and each impairment within each sport. So you may see athletes in one sport competing solely with somebody with a similar impairment, whereas in another sport you could see a range of different impairments within the same classification. I hope that makes sense. It sort of is based on some scientific research that kind of talks around how that impairment impacts with that specific sport. So it's very specific to each sport, and that's why you may see those differences across different sports. So the whole of classification is kind of governed by the IPC, and they release the IPC classification code, which is a fundamental document which the whole of classification is based upon. It applies to all IPC members, which includes international federations and national Paralympic committees, such as Paralympics GB. So the first edition of the code was released in 2015. Alongside the code, there was also five international standards for eligible impairment, athlete evaluation, protest and appeals, classifier personnel and training, classification data protection. So really five important areas that sets those international standards for the international federations creating their classification rules to kind of abide by and make sure that it's done in a similar process right across the system of Paralympic sport. Following that, they then released a new version this year, at the beginning of 2025, with three new international standards included: one on intentional misrepresentation, classifier personnel and training being updated, and some more areas around that topic, and also classification data protection again. So while the IPC code governs the whole of Paralympic sport at an international level, we within the UK also have a UK classification code, which supports the delivery of national classification. It outlines the key areas that must be considered when delivering national classification, and it applies to all Paralympics GB members, whether that's a national governing body, or a home nation or an NDSO. If they deliver national classification, they all have to abide by the UK classification code. So we first released ours in 2019. So it's been a little bit of a while since that was reviewed, and with the awareness, knowing that IPC were bringing out a 2025 version of their code, this was postponed following the Tokyo Paralympic Games when it was meant to be reviewed. It was postponed until the IPC code come out. So we are currently in the process of reviewing our code, which we aim to have released next year as an updated version to sort of not replicate, but to bring in any of the new areas from the IPC code and bringing those standards down into national classification. So a key area within the code is setting out the eligible impairments. In Paralympic sport, there are 7 eligible impairments: impaired muscle power, impaired passive range of motion or movement, limb deficiency and or limb length difference, short stature, coordination impairments, visual impairment, and intellectual impairment. And as you can see on the diagram, there is also some subcategories underneath a couple of those impairments, just to give a little bit more detail and context around what is included in those eligible impairments. So not all of these 7 eligible impairments are eligible in all sports. As I was mentioned on a previous slide, it is just sort of decided around how an eligible impairment impacts an athlete within a specific sport is how they kind of make the decisions on which eligible impairments fit within which sports. So for wheelchair fencing, we have 4 eligible impairments, which are impaired muscle power, impaired passive range of movement, limb deficiency and limb length difference, and coordination impairments. I think we'll come on to a little bit more specific around wheelchair fencing's classification system a bit later on with a bit of input from Rick as well. So essentially when an athlete attends classification, they must go through a classification process, and that is broken up into 4 stages. Stage 1 is the assessment of an underlying health condition. So this is done remotely, where the athlete, supported by their governing body, will send off their medical paperwork, the medical diagnosis form, and any medical evidence that they have to demonstrate their underlying health condition. This will then be taken by the International Federation. They appoint a UHC assessor who assesses all the information and establishes whether the athlete has an underlying health condition or not, essentially. So if the athlete does have an underlying health condition, they will then they would then proceed to step 2, which I'll come on to in a second, but that is then an in-person assessment. If they don't have an underlying health condition or not deemed to have an underlying health condition that is eligible, they can have a re-evaluation by a different set of UHC assessors, or once that process has gone through, they're just deemed not eligible for Paralympic sport. So going back to the first bit, if they were deemed to have an underlying health condition, they then move on to stage 2. And stage 2 is then an in-person assessment, except for in the cases of intellectual impairment. And the panel must verify if the athlete then has an eligible impairment consistent with what the underlying health condition says. Again, if that is done, and if following that process, it is deemed that the athlete has an eligible impairment, they would proceed to step 3. There are a couple of other bits within there. If the classification panel feel that they need some further knowledge or further documentation to support the evidence that they're seeing, they can deem the classification as not complete and then require the athlete and the support team to go away and provide further evidence before they can continue with the classification process. Or they can deem the athlete not eligible based on their eligible impairment if they don't feel the eligible impairment is eligible for the sport that they are being classified in. Stage 3 is an assessment of the minimal impairment criteria. So each sport classification rules set out what the minimal impairment criteria is for that sport. And this stage assesses solely based on the eligible impairment and assesses the athlete to see if they meet the minimum eligibility criteria or minimum impairment criteria for that specific sport. And if they do, they will then move on to stage 4. Stage 4 is the sport class being assigned a sport class. And to do this, the classification panel will ask the athlete to take part in some key sport-related tasks. Every sport has different sort of ways of testing depending on the eligible impairment. And from there, they will then assign a sports class as well as a sports status, which I will come on to in the next slide. Once that is done within the classification process in the in-person assessment, they will then observe the athlete in classification, in competition as well. Sorry, they observe the athlete in competition. So during the competition, the classifiers tend to sort of sit up in the stands and just watch what goes on, and what they're looking for is to see if what has been demonstrated within the classification room is happening in competition, and there's no sort of anomalies and questions around how the athlete has presented themselves. So this is how that process sort of looks in a flow chart diagram. As you can see, there's many different options and directions it can take depending on the information and the testing that is done throughout the assessment. But the key one on this page I wanted to talk about is the sport class statuses on the right-hand side. So an athlete can be deemed as confirmed, as a confirmed classification. This generally means that the athlete does not need further classification. There are some anomalies where maybe the sport changed their classification rules and require athletes to be reclassified, or if an impairment changes that wasn't expected, the athlete may need to go for further review at that stage. But generally, it means that the athlete doesn't need to go through further classification. And this would usually be given to an athlete following being assessed by 2 classification panels. The other options are review at the next available opportunity. And an example of when this may be used is if a classifier is unsure over something that was presented differently or potentially different from the evaluation session to what they're seeing in competition. They may provide this status, so the review at next available opportunity, because they would like to see the athlete would like the athlete to be seen by a panel of classifiers before competing at the next opportunity that they have. And the final one is the fixed review date. So usually an athlete would need to be classified twice during that process to get a confirmed status. So if you're classified for the very first time, you're usually provided with this sport class status as a fixed review date, which can typically be maybe 1 year after the first classification, sometimes 2 years. And normally for athletes who are under 18, this will also be applied, so they are reclassified once they are over 18 years of age. And there are some occasions where an athlete will never be given a confirmed classification. If they have an impairment that is known to be one that is degenerative and could potentially get worse over time, it's quite common that athlete will always have review dates, whether it's 1, 2, 4 years, depending on the impairment. It's very, very specific to individuals in that case. So international and national classification. As I mentioned earlier on, the IPC classification code governs everything internationally, while the UK classification code governs everything that's done on a national classification basis. Sorry, but what does that mean, or what are the differences between an international classification and what do they mean and a national classification? So with an international classification, every athlete is required to go through international classification to compete at international coveted events. So if an international federation is running competitions, whether that's kind of a world tour, a continental championships, a world championships, a Paralympic games, every athlete would need to go through international classification to be able to compete at those games. These classifications are organized and carried out by the International Federation, and national governing bodies will support their athletes through classification at the appropriate time on their development pathway. So when an athlete is ready to step up to international classification, your NGB will support you through that process. The difference with national classification is not all NGBs have a classification system nationally, but some do. Some will outline if it is needed for certain competitions, which could be maybe a national championships, and that must be clearly outlined in their classification rules for which competitions you can and cannot compete in, whether you have a national classification or not. Athletes who only have a national classification cannot compete in international events with only that classification. Obviously, you can then go for international classification at an international event and be able to compete as long as you're deemed eligible. But with just a national classification, you can't automatically compete at an international event. And it is advised in the UK code that all NGBs that set up a national classification system replicate the process of international classification within their sport, trying to make that pathway from national to international as seamless as possible, and that experience of going through classification as similar as possible. So athletes sort of have an experience of what to expect when they progress onto the international stage. And finally, on international and national classification, if an athlete gets awarded an international sports class, that will always supersede a national classification. So there are occasions where an athlete may be given one sport class at a national level, but a different one at international level. And at that point, the international sports class will always supersede the national classification. And also, when competing at a national level, the international sports class must then be used. Intentional misrepresentation. What is intentional misrepresentation? This is essentially an athlete or support personnel purposefully misleading or attempting to mislead a classification panel. This happens where people try and gain an advantage by not demonstrating the full extent of their impairment, to try and get into a sport class where they feel they can be more competitive, essentially cheating the system. Being complicit in such activity is also classed as intentional misrepresentation. So that's why I mentioned that support staff, if they're aware of what's going on, they are just as complicit and can be found guilty of intentional misrepresentation also, not just the athletes. So examples of what you could do to be guilty of intentional misrepresentation. You can forge documents. So forging or falsifying medical documents is deemed intentional misrepresentation. Deliberately misrepresenting the existence, nature, or degree of their impairment. So again, that's trying to maybe make out that your impairment affects you more than it does. Disrupting an evaluation session. Refusing to cooperate with the intention of misleading. So if a classifier is asking you to do certain tasks and you're refusing to do them because you know it will exploit something that you can do that you're trying to say you can't, it's those sorts of things that you're then intentionally trying to mislead the classifiers during the process. Deliberately failing to notify the International Federation of a change of their impairment that may require a review. So under the code, the IPC code, it is mandatory that if your impairment changes in any shape or form, that may mean that you need to go through a review of classification, but you deliberately fail to do that to try and hide that from classifiers and the International Federation. That is deemed as intentional misrepresentation. Instructing, encouraging, or assisting somebody to commit intentional misrepresentation. So again, as I mentioned a moment ago, if you're a coach or a member of support staff that's actively trying to get an athlete to cheat and misrepresent themselves, that is intentional misrepresentation. Concealing or covering up an offence that you know has taken place. Again, this is one that when you maybe see people say they can do or can't do one thing, and then you see them doing it somewhere else and not speaking up and sort of alerting the appropriate bodies about that, is also being a part of intentional misrepresentation. So what are the sanctions for intentional misrepresentation? Results. So if you are found guilty of intentional misrepresentation, they will disqualify all results that have happened since that intentional misrepresentation occurred, which could be quite a lot of success and potentially medals at big championships taken away from you. There is also bans. An athlete that is found guilty of misrepresentation for a first offence would typically be given a ban of anything between 1 and 4 years. And if that athlete was found to be guilty of misrepresentation on multiple occasions, it can be anything up to a lifetime ban. So it's quite a heavy sanction, and quite rightly so, because it is something that shouldn't be happening, and people should be punished correctly for trying to misrepresent and essentially cheat their way through the system. I've popped up these QR codes just to link to the IPC classification code and the UK classification code if you wanted to have a look through them in a little bit more detail. Some of them are quite large and a lot of reading, but if you wanted to have a little look behind more of what kind of governs the classification process, then these are here for you to kind of go away and have a look at. And also, I believe following this, Rick is happy to share out one, the slides with these on, but two, also a link to the classification page on the ParalympicsGB website where we have some information, a really nice classification explainer video, which I think information overload today, maybe there's a chance to go back and have a watch of that and see for some other areas of it and gain a greater understanding. And as always, if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, share them with British Fencing, and they'll get in touch and I'm happy to answer. Rick, do you want to come in at this point and just have a quick 5 minutes around what wheelchair fencing classification systems look like and maybe a little bit on what the national classification system looks like within British fencing?
Yeah, so I think you had a slide on it. Have you taken the slide out, Joshua, or is it still
I
here?
Sorry, yeah,
You
I
took
took
it
the slide
away.
out. It was a
Oh,
little, it
bad
was a
man.
little bit, it was a little bit messy, so I didn't want to leave it in. Sorry.
Um, that's okay. So our classification system is based on your mobility impairment largely. So there are three sport classes, which we refer to as A, B, and C. Well, there are multiple sport classes within that, but fundamentally it breaks down into A, B, and C, which is where you'd compete against people. So if someone's classified as an A, that means they have good front control, good mobility above their waist. If they're a B, they have less trunk control and mobility above their waist, lower capabilities. And if they're a C, at the moment the C's also compete against the B's because there aren't enough of them. That involves impairment to the upper arms as well. So someone like BBVO who doesn't have either arm would be classed as a C. We are also currently in the process of looking at visual impairment and how that might be brought into the sport. As far as I'm aware, the IF are doing that at the moment. So our minimum impairment criteria is based around lower limb impairment, and you have to score a certain impairment criteria before you're then classified into your sport specific class on that lower limb impairment. Now we have both national and international classification that occurs. Our domestic classification we view here at British Fencing as kind of a clearinghouse. It's a way to support athletes to understand whether or not they can pass through to international classification um, and what to expect and how to understand the principles and the steps that they need to take. Those the domestic classification follows exactly the World Ability Sport international classification systems. Our domestic classifiers are trained by World Ability Sport to classify. However, they're not as experienced as the international classifiers, and so then there can be a discrepancy between the decisions that get made in domestically and the decisions that get made internationally. We run classification about 3 times a year in what we refer to as our classification cohort. So you can go on to the British Fencing website and apply to join the next cohort. And then we also do quite a bit of training and support to help you understand and position yourself as best you can through this process, because we understand that classification can be quite challenging and traumatic. It is a really important part of para sport, but at the same time, it can be a real challenge for those who are trying to go through it. So we have a support process with our welfare team that can help you through that process. Do you think there's anything I missed, Josh?
No, that's amazing. And you're right, classification is a very athlete centric thing that the welfare of the athlete and everybody involved is really a high priority. So it's great to hear that
Yeah.
that's happening within fencing, already. So that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, it was it's a recent pickup since I became the classification administrator that we recognized and understood the challenges inherent in the system and are looking at more and more ways that we can support people through those. Um, so, I mean, this was a really great presentation on the fundamentals. I think the one other thing that I feel we need to say, Joshua, is that our classifiers and the international classifiers are the only people who can determine a person's sport class and classification setup. So it's really important that a coach, whatever you think the athlete might be within that within that setup, that the coach doesn't, set up an athlete for failure by telling them that they're going to meet a certain class or be able to classify or not, and allow our trained um, classifiers to do that job. But if you do, if you do have any questions with the coach, you can always come to British Fencing. If I can't answer it, we'll get in touch with Joshua and he can answer it. But at that, I think I'd love to thank Joshua before we pause the recording. And then after we pause the recording, we can have some questions. Thank you so much, Joshua. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.